To get started, there's been a number of developments in Canadian foreign policy worth discussing and thinking about. Yesterday, Melanie Joly tweeted about Juan Guaido had been the self-declared president of Venezuela, had been disrupted and really assaulted at a event that he was participating in, and people sort of ran him out of the room, and some chairs were thrown, and his shirt was sort of partially ripped. Foreign Minister Joly tweeted about it, saying that we are deeply concerned by yesterday's attack on interim President Juan Guaido. We condemn all forms of violence. Over the weekend, Israel fired a bunch of rockets from the illegally occupied Golan Heights into the Damascus airport, and actually damaged the Damascus airport. And of course, there was no condemnation of that violence from Justin Trudeau's government. That's in recent years, Israel's launched dozens into the hundreds of 100+ attacks, bombings in Syria, to the best of my knowledge, with complete silence from the Trudeau government. But irrespective of the double standard on violence, this is just a continuation of this 3.5-year charade of claiming that Guaido is the president of Venezuela when Guaido controls nothing. It's quite an embarrassing charade, and fewer and fewer countries are going along with the exercise. But I think that you'll probably find that Trudeau will be the last, maybe the UK, but Canada and the UK will be the last to turn to give up the charade whenever Washington decides that it's all over. Another issue that got a fair bit of attention this week on Canadian foreign policy is the Parliamentary Budget officer releasing a report saying that Canada hadn't hit the 2% of GDP in military spending. And this is really an odious alliance, the NATO, that came up with this 2% budget question, that just sort of randomly decided in 2006, 60 years into the existence of NATO, that the 2% of GDP was some marker that countries should attain. And so it just kind of plucked from thin air. And now you have Canada's Parliamentary Budget officer putting out a report saying that we have to spend tens and tens of billions of dollars per year more to attain this random marker of what should be spent on the military. And it's so much of this becomes about the question, right? The Canadian government has committed itself to the UN a plan for 0.7% of GDP going to international aid. Canada's at about 0.21%. So it's like less than a third of the 0.7%. And yet there's almost no discussion of Canada reaching that marker that it had agreed to through the UN. Of course, the question of aid in and of itself is a broader question, but certainly aid spending is better than military spending. Also this week, Trudeau went to Colorado, to the NORAD headquarters in Colorado, en route to the Summit of the Americas in LA. And he stopped and he met with the troops, and it was a real sort of PR exercise in support of NORAD. NORAD is presented as a defensive alliance, right? It's about protecting Canadian, US airspace, originally from Soviet bombers coming over from the north. That was what was presented. back at the start of the Cold War. NORAD was set up in 1958. So it's presented as defensive arrangement, but that's ridiculous. I mean, NORAD provides surveillance and communication support for Iraq War in 2003, the earlier Iraq War, early 90s. It basically provides surveillance support for all US wars. Even if it didn't do that, right? Even if it actually was defensive, the idea that you can have a defensive arrangement with a military that has 800 bases around the world, that has special operations set up in 100 plus countries, that in and of itself is absurd. To be providing defense to the U.S. empire is really makes no sense. So it's just a further Canadian contribution to the biggest purveyor of violence probably the world has ever seen, the U.S. Military. Another development worth commenting on was a comment by Erin O'Toole, the former head of the Conservative Party, who said, quote, "We lost 8 or 9 seats to foreign interference from China." So he's sort of trying to justify his defeat in the recent election on the ground of Chinese interference in Canadian political life. I think it is correct to say that I believe three ridings that have heavy concentration of Chinese Canadians, 2 in Richmond, BC, the suburb of Vancouver, and 1 in Toronto. I think it's maybe the Markham riding in Toronto. That the Chinese Canadian vote, voting against the Conservatives, contributed to a couple of Conservative incumbents losing their seats. And quite frankly, that's, I think, all for the better. Quite frankly, the Conservatives were pursuing aggressively anti-China policies that were clearly having blowback on the Chinese Canadian community in this country. But what O'Toole is doing, first of all, wildly exaggerating the question and not taking any ownership for the policies he was pursuing and how they, members of the Chinese Canadian community have been rightfully uncomfortable with those policies, a whole foreign agents list that he was pursuing, which in and of itself, a foreign agents list is not necessarily a bad idea, but you would find that it's actually, the U.S. government and the Israeli government that would, be the most figures who would be on any sort of genuine foreign agents list. What O'Toole is doing, I think, is dangerous from the standpoint of the Chinese Canadian community and stoking anti-Chinese sentiment. But it's also basically flowing into this whole rising tensions with China. And I would say O'Toole is sort of setting up what could become Canada's Chinagate. And today I'm happy to have old friend Aaron Mate on this session, who did more than anyone to expose the Russiagate in the U.S. and the claims that Russia was who put Donald Trump into the presidency. And part of the reason having Aaron on today was because on Thursday there was this report from the University of Calgary titled "Disinformation and Russia-Ukraine War on Canadian Social Media." And Aaron was number 2. He was the number 2 listed Russian-influenced accounts on their little listing. Aaron is somebody who we went to high school in grade 9 together. We were in the Concordia Student Union together when there was those protests against Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Concordia, and then we were engaged in Haiti solidarity activism together. He was actually the co-conspirator to the initial disruption of a Canadian minister. We disrupted Pierre Pettigrew at a Haiti conference in 2005 over his role in overthrowing the elected government in Haiti and supporting all kinds of violence. People probably know Aaron's with the Gray Zone. He's previously been with Real News, with Democracy Now, and he's very prolific on Twitter. And if you're on Twitter and you're not already following Aaron, I think you should do that. So basically, I just wanted to talk to Aaron about this report and his opinion about it. And so just a little background on this report that actually got a lot of media attention. The Globe and Mail had it in the paper on Thursday. The Canadian Press ran a story that was picked up all over. The main author of the report appeared on a whole bunch of TV and radio programs, continuing until today. And the report is kind of remarkable. The first reading of it, I thought it was sort of like the executive summary, and all the substance was somewhere else. It was a little confusing, to be honest with you. And basically, it's claiming that there's these influencers that are putting out 5 themes that are viewed as Russian disinformation. And the 5 themes, 2 of the themes are quote, promoting a specific mistrust of Canada's Liberal government, and especially of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Another theme is portraying NATO as an aggressive alliance using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. So it's a pretty broad category of people that would be considering mistrust of Justin Trudeau. And I think there's quite a few people who think that NATO is an aggressive alliance. But yeah, I just wanted to start off by asking you, Aaron. Well, first of all, Aaron, thanks for coming on. And what was your take on this report?
Yves, thanks for having me. It's great to join you and to see you. And it's great to continue this alliance that we've developed, starting in high school when we both realized that we were lefties. And it's just, I love that it continues, 30 years later. So it's great to talk to you. Thanks for having me. First of all, I mean, like that line right there, that somehow, these Twitter accounts like mine promote mistrust in Justin Trudeau. Is he like our dear leader? Are we supposed to not have mistrust in our dear leaders? It's such a totalitarian mindset. I mean, all leaders we're supposed to not trust. That's the nature of being in a democracy, right? Is the leaders earn our trust and they hopefully do the will of the people. And journalists, if they're doing their job, try to hold those leaders to account. But this study is premised on such a totalitarian mindset. And it's ironic because he claims to be doing so in the name of defending democracy from foreign subversion, right? So these things are always very revealing. And of course, as you say, like the basis for the study and the data set, it's not even explained. It's a very brief document. I asked the study author, J.C. Boucher, who, by the way, as I understand, Dmitry Laskarius said that he's funded by the Canadian Department of Defense to the tune of $2.4 million, which I did not see the Canadian media report on when it was parroting his study's claims. But the methodology, he doesn't even explain, like, how did you determine whether someone is Russian influenced and what constitutes disinformation that we're supposedly spreading? I asked the study's author, J.C. Boucher of the University of Calgary, I asked him on Twitter, like, can you give me an example of me spreading disinformation? And also, like, how did you even do your study? And he promised to send me some information, which he hasn't. So I'm still waiting on that with bated breath. But yeah, look, I mean, this is what you do in this current environment where you can't challenge dissenting voices on the facts. So you have to come up with creative ways to make them look malign and nefarious. And the way to do that is to basically suggest that everything we're doing is tainted by the specter of the Russian boogeyman. And that's been, it's been the playbook in a long time. Like the McCarthy era, communists or dissenting voices were all, the civil rights movement, everyone was tainted with the specter of the Soviet Union. Martin Luther King was a Soviet Union agent. That was the allegation used against him and many others. And that's been repackaged during the Russiagate era, which really accelerated in 2016. So when you can't contest people on the facts, on the merits, you have to come up with ways to marginalize them and make them beyond the pale. So you put them in this camp of being Russian influenced and spreading Russian disinformation. And the operative definition of Russian disinformation to me is basically any factual information that undermines the, NATO Western consensus, right? If we question NATO's role in the Ukraine crisis, if we question our own government's responsibility around the world, not just even in Ukraine, then that is deemed to be Russian disinformation. And I know it certainly works amongst academics like this guy, and it certainly works among people who call themselves journalists, like everybody in the Canadian media who just repeated this guy's study as if it was somehow significant or serious. But I don't know how it plays with the public, because I have to hope that most people can see through it. But that's the power of our propaganda system. If you repeat certain things enough times, and if you completely exclude all dissenting voices, maybe it is effective. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that to me was pretty striking, that like if you see the corporate media reports on the study, there's nothing critical in it. It's just presented as he's proven something. Yeah. But then when you go on to Twitter and you actually look at people engaging with it, there's actually a lot of dissent. There's almost no one backing him besides maybe a few like of his friends. And there's like just so little in the actual study. It's kind of remarkable that a journalist would just pick this up and go with it, and it would appear in the paper of the Globe and Mail, supposedly a serious paper. I should mention, as you pointed out, Aaron, that Boucher, the lead author of the study, is on his own bio at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, which is a military and arms industry funded think tank, that he says that he's in charge of $2.4 million in D&D money. And then on his bio at the University of Calgary, he talks about being the head or the co-lead of the Canadian Network on Information and Security, which is an initiative that the Canadian military instigated, financed to get going. So he's somebody who's clearly tied into military funding. And I should also point out that University of Calgary School of Public Policy, which is where the study is saying it's coming from, is a kind of interesting. It's viewed as sort of a right-wing think tank housed at the University of Calgary, set up with $4 million from a prominent oil and gas lawyer. And funnily enough, it was launched in 2009 with a gala where the keynote speaker was Condoleezza Rice. So it's very much tied into to sort of neocon kind of world. Yeah. And that more generally, I think this opens up a whole question about the propaganda system in this country and how much the military is involved in funding academic programs and think tanks, and they have their own history department and stuff like that. But yeah, so I mean, this is you've been attacked endlessly for exposing the Russiagate, and when the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, when we did an event with you a few months ago, we were taken aback by how much Twitter sort of hostility there was towards having you on. So this is part of the intellectual climate in sort of liberal opinion in the U.S. I think even more clearly than it is in this country, but clearly Boucher is trying to bring that kind of thinking here. You authored I thought a very important piece maybe 4 or 5 days ago, a week ago, where you discuss Matt Duss, who is a advisor for Bernie Sanders. And he wrote a piece titled, I think, "Why Ukraine Matters for the Left, for the New Republic," where he basically endorses the US sending $40 billion and partially or significantly in weaponry, but also other forms of assistance. And I thought this was a really important piece, because we have a similar dynamic in this country, where even people far to the left, or on the left, have really aligned with NATO's policy in Russia or in Ukraine, and sort of a proxy war with Russia. So yeah, just sort of lay out your argument in that piece, and and how Matt Duss is sort of attacking the left for not going along with U.S. policy.
I've never seen the institutional political left in North America at such a weak and craven point. I mean, the NDP too, didn't they recently just sign on to more money for the military, right? In the new liberal budget in exchange for, I think, increased social spending, but that was a trade-off. They agreed to like spending even more money on the military. And there too, they've been totally on board with the NATO line about Ukraine. And the same thing inside the Democratic Party in the US, where it's supposed to be this exciting time. We have members of the Democratic Socialists of America elected to Congress, like AOC and and the rest of the squad. And you have Bernie Sanders, who, a lot of things about him that I've really admired over the years. But on foreign policy, they're in complete lockstep with the neocons, at least on the neocons' most important project, which is the Ukraine proxy war. And here in the US, where I am, there was a recent vote for $40 billion in additional spending on the Ukraine proxy war. Most of that money goes right to military contractors, like more than half of it. And every single member of the squad and the entire congressional caucus, including Bernie Sanders, voted for it. And nobody even bothered to explain their vote. So these people who are, have the right messaging about we need to spend money on social programs, not war, when they get an opportunity to vote on this pivotal bill, which essentially is a gift to the military industrial complex and assures that the Ukraine proxy war will go on rather than being resolved, they all vote for it and don't even bother to explain why they did that. And that on top of the fact that they voted for it, the fact that they didn't even feel compelled to explain their vote, that there's no constituency holding them to account to explain it, it speaks to how normalized this neocon, Cold Warrior approach to the world has gotten, where the left doesn't even feel compelled to provide an explanation for supporting it, on top of the very fact they support it. So my article was about Matt Duss. He was one of the few people in that circle to actually come out and try to explain why it's worth supporting more weapons for Ukraine. And he is the foreign policy to Bernie Sanders. And he says all these things like, our political class advocates political violence at a rate that is psychopathic. And he says that, the left should absolutely be critical of our foreign policy decisions and whether or not they're helping the world. He's saying all the right things, but then he turns around and he just blindly advocates supporting the Ukraine proxy war. And he does so basically by erasing all the relevant facts. And that's, so I'm trying to point out what he's missing, including the critical US role in this crisis in Ukraine. People want to pretend that Vladimir Putin just woke up one day and decided to invade. And while I don't support the invasion, I wish Russia had handled its grievances in other ways, and I believe they could have. I don't accept this argument that Russia had no choice but to invade. I'm open to the argument, but I don't accept it. I can't believe that they exhausted all the diplomatic options. But I'm not going to pretend that Russia just decided one day to invade Ukraine because Vladimir Putin wants to expand the Soviet empire. There's a whole context that is very available to anyone who wants to see it. And we've talked about it before. The last time I joined you guys at the Institute, NATO expansion, and just in Ukraine itself, the US backing a coup in 2014, and then using Ukraine for a proxy war that much predates the Russian invasion. I mean, for the last 8 years, the US has actually flooded Ukraine with billions of dollars worth of weapons and supported it in a proxy war against Russian-backed rebels in the East, who were basically revolted in 2014 against a US-backed coup government that was waging war on them. And that context is completely erased. It's like most people, I'm not even sure if Matt Duss is aware of it, the Bernie Sanders guy. I have a hard time believing that, but maybe he just doesn't know. And the reason he doesn't know is because, the broader left and our media just won't report on the relevant facts. And so it takes a huge amount of amnesia to ignore what's going on. And then look, even if you don't accept my rendering of the relevant history and the Minsk Accords and all that stuff, just now, the logic of flooding Ukraine with more weapons instead of trying to try at least for a diplomatic solution, it's crazy. And this is what the left is now. It's like, we're going to support flooding war zones with more weapons and not prioritize diplomacy. even if we don't agree on the factual background, which to me is pretty overwhelming, but putting that aside, like, it's crazy. And yeah, but there's no one in the left right now, at least the political left, that I see in the US or Canada, who's willing to defy the consensus. It's a scary time.
Yeah, I find that striking. Like I've been watching Democracy Now's coverage, and they're willing to have people on that talk about NATO expansion as a contributing factor. But I've probably watched like 50 Ukraine-related clips on Democracy Now over the past few months, and I don't think maybe once or twice has 2014 even been mentioned, right? So like the coup is just, it's just you can't even mention that there was a coup. And it's also like astounding that some people on the left, like Todd Gordon, who's the author of a book called Imperialist Canada, right? Not many books that are titled Imperialist Canada. And when I refer to 2014 as a coup, he calls me a campist, right? He just like, I'm a tanky, you're a campist. And like, even if you didn't agree with my assessment of what happened in 2014, where the Canadian embassy was used as a safe haven for more than a week for Maidan protesters. Foreign Minister John Baird was at Maidan Square, like egging people on. The spokesperson for the Canadian embassy was a leading Maidan activist. I mean, like, Canada was totally, and they've been supporting it for the opposition for years. Even if you didn't agree with that like assessment that it was a coup, the idea that by saying it's a coup, you're therefore like just doing Vladimir Putin's useful idiot or whatever. It's a pretty remarkable that's the case, and it's remarkable that like Democracy Now just won't look at or barely look at 2014. And on the question of negotiations and like a diplomatic solution, this is what Heather McPherson, the NDP foreign affairs critic, tweeted out 5 or 6 days ago, after Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, used the word about we don't want to humiliate Russia or Putin. McPherson tweeted, "This is not someone we should be negotiating with or worrying about humiliating." So she's saying explicitly no negotiations, and she's like reacting to the French president saying like you're too much of like a pro-Putin. It's a pretty extreme kind of a situation, which clearly the Matt Duss article shows, but also one of the points I think that I thought was very important in that article was how you delve into the opposition to negotiations, right? How the British and Americans have been, trying to undercut the negotiations before February 24th, and then subsequently. You care to comment on that?
Well, I mean, yes, and first let me say, on the point about not being able to mention certain things, and you gave the example of Democracy Now. It's a great example of how beautiful our propaganda system works, where certain facts are just stigmatized, where you internalize this understanding that if you go to certain places, then you're going to be called names. You're going to be called a Putin apologist. And that's enough, I think, subconsciously. I don't think this is like a deliberate thought process, but that's enough to subconsciously dissuade people from going there. So Bernie Sanders, before the war in Ukraine, he was talking about NATO expansion and how that was something we needed to be critical of. And so like what happens in that climate is people like Bernie Sanders, who are influential figures, they sort of lay out the parameters, the acceptable parameters of discussion. So, okay, that then sends the message that you can talk about NATO expansion, and NATO expansion that's sometimes mentioned in the media. But in the media, they don't talk about the coup of 2014. They never refer to it as a coup. The farthest they'll go is they'll say, some people call it a coup. But what do you call when a democratically elected president is violently overthrown by a fascist-led mob? That's just a fact. And the US is caught on tape picking the next leadership. That's the tape of Victoria Nuland that was caught on tape. She's speaking to the US ambassador, talking about who should be the next Ukrainian leadership. And that's exactly who became the next Ukrainian leadership after the coup happened. So what is that if not a coup? But amazingly, even a place like Democracy Now, which when I used to work there would report on the Victoria Nuland stuff and would talk about the coup in Ukraine would have on people like Stephen F. Cohen, the late scholar, to talk about it. Even now, they can't even acknowledge and go to places that they used to go to 8 years ago. And that just speaks to how powerful our propaganda system is, and how subconsciously people, by virtue of seeing certain facts not being discussed anymore and certain facts being labeled as somehow an apology for Russia and like the Putin boogeyman, that's enough to dissuade people from going there. And it makes those of us on the margins, like it puts those of us who are willing to speak about these facts even more marginal. And that's just how it is. But it's just amazing to witness. And in terms of sabotaging diplomacy, that's another aspect of this. It was reported in the Ukrainian media that Zelensky, in late March, he presented a 10-point plan to Russia. It included neutrality for Ukraine. And after that, there was talk of, of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. But then Boris Johnson went to Kiev in that visit he did, where he basically like went there for a photo op with Zelensky. But at that meeting, according to Ukrainian media, Johnson told Zelensky not to negotiate. Said, we think Putin can lose here. So sorry, there's no negotiations. And by the way, if you were to reach a security guarantee with Putin, we're not going to back you up. So that's essentially telling Zelensky to, forget it. And it speaks to a few things. First of all, there's no way Boris Johnson is doing this on his own. He's doing this at the behest of the US. The UK does the US's bidding. It's the US's junior partner. That's why it was used to put out the phony dossier about Iraqi WMDs. That's why before Russia's invasion, UK was used to put out a whole bunch of claims that the US wanted to put out there, but didn't want to put out there itself. And so Boris Johnson's there delivering this on behalf of the US. I think it's fair to assume that. And the fact that Zelensky goes along with it speaks to who's really in charge here. It's not Zelensky. It's his patrons in the US and the UK and their NATO allies. And so, after that, negotiations didn't happen. And that's really who is in charge. And Matt Duss in his article says that Zelensky's continued to offer to negotiate with Putin. When you click on the article that he presents to support that claim, and you see right there that Zelensky says, we're not going to negotiate until you withdraw entirely from our territory, including Crimea, which means like negotiations will never happen. So the fantasy world that people like Matt Duss are living in is that the U.S. has done all it can to pursue diplomacy, and it's just impossible right now to negotiate with this madman Putin. The reality is far different. The reality is that the U.S. and its allies are undermining diplomacy and ensuring that more Ukrainians will die. That's essentially their policies, using Ukrainians as cannon fodder for their hegemonic designs against Russia, because they want to weaken Russia. They want to bleed its economy more. They want to kill more Russian soldiers, I guess. It's madness.
Yeah, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to get your head around those calculations, but the reality is that you see those types of inhumane calculations in Canadian policy from Haiti to Palestine, to Venezuela, to Ukraine. So the idea that the Canadian and American governments would want to pump in weapons and have us not worry about how many Ukrainians died in the process of weakening Russia is actually, it fits with the broad outlines of the policy around the world, and especially if there's some arms companies that are doing well by it all, that further feeds the beast. I wanted to come back before opening up to questions. If people have any questions for Aaron, I wanted to come back to something that back to the 2014 coup that University of Ottawa professor Ivan Kachinovsky just reported on yesterday. Is that he's reporting that that there's now a further I think it hadn't been confirmed, which is that in the Maidan massacre trial revealed that the prosecution stopped all on-site investigative experiments to determine locations of shooters after first experiment showed that Maidan protester was shot from the Maidan-controlled hotel Ukraina. So that's the part of the background in understanding what happened in 2014. I think most people on here probably know, but I mean, the 2014, the overthrow of Yanukovych's government, that then leads to the war in the East, which is clearly essential in understanding what's going on today. But also specifically what happened at the Maidan Square and what precipitated what legitimated the ouster is that the evidence that it was the far right forces that were actually killing protesters, like killing their own. The evidence of that has grown, and what the Professor Kachovnovsky at U of O, who's been the kind of leading person in following this issue, is he's further confirming that when evidence was found that it was the far right that was actually doing the sniper killing, that then the investigations just stopped. So it's pretty remarkable that this stuff can be reported on, and again, it doesn't get mentioned in Matt Duss does a whole article where he just ignores that issue.
Yeah, and same thing, Yves, with the Odessa massacre, which happened a little bit later in May 2014. This is you have dozens of people in Odessa who are protesting the Maidan coup, and they're burned alive by fascists, by government supporters. And in the crowd are people like Andre Perubi, who at that point was appointed to be a top minister in the new coup government. And these people were burned alive, dozens of them. The official death toll is something like 48, but some people suspect it's far worse. No one's ever been prosecuted for that. Nobody. And we're supposed to just forget those victims. Those are what Chomsky and Herman called unworthy victims in manufacturing consent, because they're people who are killed by forces that we support, so they don't count. But atrocities like that were major factors as well in fueling the war in the Donbass, where that's why people in the Donbass took up arms, is because they were Russian speakers, people identified with Russia, who didn't want to live under the government that replaced the government they voted for in Yanukovych. They revolted, and in the case of Odessa, they were burned alive, and no prosecutions for Maidan either. It speaks to what Ivan has uncovered, and no one's done more research than him in exposing the role of far right forces in that incident. And but again, because it's inconvenient to the narrative, it just gets ignored.
And from my book, Left Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada, 2018, I looked at Canadian unions. So the Odessa Massacre happens at the Federation of Trade Union Office, the headquarters in Odessa. And I looked at Canadian unions, and I couldn't find any Canadian union that put out a statement criticizing the fact that up to 50 people, or maybe more, were killed by far right forces at a union hall in the Ukraine. So a number of unions had actually put out statements about Maidan and basically supportive of the Canadian government perspective. But when all these people are killed at a union office, there's silence from the Canadian unions, which I don't think is because all the people in the Canadian unions are necessarily aren't appalled at killing people at a union office, but it's that the media just didn't cover it, and so they're not doing the work to go beyond the dominant media, and so they don't even know it happened, and that dynamic. So I'll go to questions if anyone has any comments or questions they want to. I see Yuri. Go ahead, Yuri.
Hey, Yves and Aaron. Actually, my question is a bit off topic, but some questions in the chat are more related to Ukraine. So I probably should go last, or at least after some of those related questions on Ukraine and so forth, and Bernie.
I haven't been actually looking at the questions in the chat. Maybe I'll go ahead, Laura, and I'll take a look at the chat.
I just have a two-part question for you, Aaron. And one is whether you think you're seeing any difference in the mainstream media now and how they're starting to talk about the size of the weaponry and packages going to Ukraine. I feel like I'm seeing a few things suggesting now, how do we even know how they're going to be used? I'm hearing a little bit of that. So I just wonder if that might change a little bit. And the other thing sort of connected to that is whether you think with rising inflation and oil and gas prices that because studies have come out showing that the Ukraine situation is one of the reasons for that you might see more people coming out for a negotiated settlement out of self-interest.
I do think we're seeing sanity, some semblance of sanity starting to creep in. I haven't followed the Canadian media too closely, but in the US, the New York Times came out with an editorial that was like way more sane than anything that Bernie Sanders has said. They were basically saying that the US has to make clear to Ukraine that there are limits on how far we'll go in our support and our provision of weapons, and there has to be a diplomatic off-ramp. We have to negotiate with Russia. That's better than anything that's coming from like Bernie Sanders, which is sad that it's a New York Times editorial board, which is a reflexive supporter of US hegemony and militarism, showing a sign of sanity that apparently Democrats can't locate. And especially now that Zelensky's admitting that like Ukrainian soldiers by the hundreds are being killed every single day, I think you're seeing more acknowledgement of that. The spin we got for the first 3 months of the war was that Ukraine is they're humiliating Russia. Russia tried to take the capital Kiev. It got defeated, which I think is not true. I don't think Russia ever tried to seriously take Kiev. But anyway, I'm also not a military expert, so who knows? But that picture we got of this like stalwart Ukrainian resistance defeating Russia at every juncture, I think that's starting to crack because you can't hide the reality anymore. The fact is, part of the reason why I think it was so insane to support this proxy war is even if you think Russia is the most guilty party in the world and it's all Russia's fault, and the US and Ukraine did nothing at all to provoke Russia, just the fact that Russia's sheer size and its proximity to Ukraine gives it such an overwhelming military advantage. So it always seemed to me to make no sense that even if you flood Ukraine with all the weapons in the world, Russia will always be able to overmatch Ukraine because it's right there, and it's such a huge power and a huge military, way bigger than Ukraine's. And the people saying this are like, at one point, we're not just people like us, but also, Barack Obama, after he oversaw the Maidan coup in 2014, he was under huge bipartisan pressure to send more weapons to Ukraine. And he didn't. It was reported in the New York Times, because he didn't want to further inflame a proxy war that he started, although that part isn't mentioned. He started it, but he didn't want to, and also he felt that Russia would always prevail because Russia has more of a military strength. And Antony Blinken, who is now the Secretary of State, when he was in the Obama State Department back then, said that no matter what we do, Russia will always be able to overmatch us, by a factor of 4 and 5. So back then they recognized this, but all of a sudden that understanding was thrown out the window this time in favor of escalating a proxy war. So I think now finally, after 3 months, Russia is starting to make the costs to Ukraine untenable. And there's more of an appetite now for diplomacy than there was before. So we'll see if that makes a difference. I mean, never underestimate just how bloodthirsty and sadistic the forces inside Washington are. So we'll see. And then, look, in response to inflation being at record highs, rising gas prices, what is Joe Biden saying? He said it just the other day. He said, this is, Americans are feeling the pain of Putin's price hike. Who's going to buy that except for people on cable television? I mean, no one's buying that. So I imagine there's got to be somebody in the White House who has some brain cells working who can understand that, unless they're just completely blinded by their hatred of Russia and their desire for a proxy war. So maybe that'll make a difference. I don't know. Certainly, I don't think average people are going to accept this notion that they need to sacrifice their well-being and pay higher costs and go without the basics for their family because Joe Biden blames Vladimir Putin. I don't think most people are going to buy that.
People might buy, though, don't you think, that gas and oil prices might go up because there's less of it being shipped in the world, and that this, even if they want them to cut off Russia, they must recognize that this could have an impact on that. So just out of self-interest.
Yeah, I hope people recognize that we didn't have to cut off Russia from the global economy, and we didn't have to have this proxy war. But it is hard for people when they're not being presented with any kind of alternative to the dominant narrative, which is this is all Vladimir Putin's fault, Putin's price hike. I mean, if in certain circles, that's like a mantra, just Putin's price hike, Putin's price hike, Putin's price hike. So, I mean, if people can pierce through the propaganda, then that should be the awareness.
Go ahead, Yuri.
Okay. Well, Eve, first question to you. I wanted to ask you if the Indigenous and Black communities in Canada and the whole defund, abolish the police movement, have they been starting, any signs of them starting to speak out more on Canada's imperialism overseas and Canada's anti-Black and anti-Indigenous policies overseas? And Mr. Matse, it's an honor to speak to you. I've been a big fan of you for a long time. And I wanted to ask you, because July the 4th is coming up next month, and I wanted to ask you, what's it going to take for the broad left in the US, from the workers' movement to Black Lives Matter to queer liberation to the Latinx pride? What's it going to take for people-powered movements in the US, including the left-leaning press, to address the plight of Native Americans, Hawaiians, and Alaskans? Because I know in Canada it's become, a huge issue that much of the left is addressing. But in the U.S., the plight of Indigenous people is still criminally overlooked. It's still criminally, underreported. And I'm just curious, when is the US going to get to the level that Canada, New Zealand, and to an extent Australia has in addressing the plight of Indigenous people?
Well, I'll start. I was actually an editorial op-ed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the day before, worrying that the land acknowledgements was going to move. We're going to move from becoming the norm in Canada to becoming, they're increasingly common in the US. And they were saying this was like a terrible sign of the woke culture percolating to south from Canada. And I think they claimed it all begins in Australia. I mean, I think that as a general rule, the mainstream of those movements in Canada are not involved in challenging Canadian imperialism. I mean, with Black Lives Matters in Canada, the more leftward element on like Haiti, that's an issue that I have some knowledge with. There's people like L. Jones, Robin Maynard, people like that have signed on to petitions that Canadian Foreign Policy Institute has put out on Canada's role in Haiti and stuff like that. So there's some, but not at the mainstream, right? Not the sort of more mainstream. Black voices are very hesitant to challenge Canada's role in Haiti, and there's some with regards to Indigenous First Nations. I mean, you got to look at the different issues, but generally, I would say no. There's not a whole lot of it with the mainstream appetite to challenge Canadian foreign policy. On a question like Palestine, the Israel lobby has tried very hard to sort of co-opt Indigenous leadership, I think, to undercut some of the sort of anti-settler colonial solidarity that between Indigenous and Palestinian movements. But clearly, at the someone like Ellen Gabriel here in Montreal is somebody who Indigenous Mohawk activist, somebody who has stood up on the Palestinian question, and there examples like that. But as a general rule, it fits with the dominant media sort of excludes these issues. It's challenging Canadian foreign policy, certainly in any sort of kind of radical way is quite marginalizing in the political culture, and understandably the history of colonialism in this country is so terrible that there's lots of issues that are closer to home, if you like, to work on. So it makes sense that international issues are sort of put a bit aside.
Yeah, can I say on this question too? I mean, like a major problem is that the victims of Western hegemony have no lobby group on their behalf in Ottawa or Washington. No one's going to lobby for the people of Gaza or of Syria or Venezuela. And the media, in Canada and the US will only, in terms of, voices from these countries that are being targeted, they'll only basically, especially with Ukraine, they'll only highlight diaspora voices that are on board with Western policy, right? And so you get the sense, if you just follow the media, that like, all Venezuelans or all Ukrainians are on board with the Western government policy. And, as I've learned when I actually go to places that are the targets of Western hegemony, whether it's Venezuela or Syria, those people that are just, they have no voice. And so it makes it very difficult to get average, Westerners to care. As Yves says, people are concerned about domestic issues. And also there's no voice really to advocate on behalf of people who are really suffering. There's no lobby group that, gets funded, that, millions of dollars, like all these think tanks in DC and Ottawa. It just doesn't exist like that. So it's very difficult to get people to care. And then you add the fact that, again, diaspora groups, like especially in Canada with Ukraine, that go along with the government narrative, they're the ones who get paid attention to. Whereas, people who don't support a proxy war in their country, or who have actually been targeted by the coup government that we've been supporting, they don't get a voice. So it's just a challenge. And in terms of your question about Indigenous people, I don't have an answer for you. I think things have gotten better than they used to be. There's more awareness, but it's a great question, and it's not something I can answer. It's going to happen when it happens, and but it hasn't happened obviously to a sufficient level.
Any other questions, comments that people have? There's a couple in the chat that somebody talks about Barbara Lee voting against or voting for the $40 billion.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Is it my turn?
Yeah, go, Andre.
I'm Andre.
Yeah, go ahead, Andre.
Noticing today that there was news on the International Public Tribunal on Ukraine, and there was a presentation in English by a fellow called John Mark Duggan, and the stuff that he was saying was really it's unbelievable. It has to do with the fact that the United States, through Mrs. Newland and the CIA, were actually totally in control of 46 biolabs in Ukraine. And there had been experiments on people in Ukraine with at least 30 deaths. And I think we should notice these biolab stories, because I'm asking, first of all, this fellow Duggan has been banished by the Mirovets thing. He's on the kill list in Ukraine. And secondly, how do you explain the fact that this came out in about 12 different areas on the same day? There's something going on. Can you look into this tribunal, Aaron?
I haven't heard of it, so I can't really comment on it. I haven't looked much into the biolab thing, because I do think it was weird when Victoria Nuland was asked about, does Ukraine have biological weapons? This was in a Senate hearing a few months ago, and she didn't give a straight answer. She didn't say no. She then she just said there are biological research facilities inside of Ukraine, and we're concerned that Russia will seize them. And that raised all the speculation that there's been, and Russia accused the US of developing dangerous pathogens targeting Russia inside Ukraine. But, honestly, I haven't seen the evidence for that. And I suspect Russia might have been embellishing there for its own propaganda purposes. I can't prove that, but I just haven't seen any convincing evidence for it. Maybe I'm missing something, but that whole thing, it didn't strike me as particularly convincing. And I didn't look much into it. Some people think there's something there, and maybe there is, I don't know. But my instinct tells me that was
I think it's
overblown.
very pertinent to our future.
It is very pertinent.
But it's an international tribunal. Is it credible, you think?
I don't know. I have to look at it, and then I can let you know. But I haven't heard of it, so I don't know.
I wish you would. I'm
Okay.
finished.
Are there any other questions, comments?
Stop you.
If not,
Stop.
little Joshua wants to say, any other questions, comments? Okay, well, so you want to say bye-bye to everyone? Say, take care, everyone. Have a
Bye,
good
Joshua.
night. Thanks everyone for coming out. See you next week.
Bye, Joe.